So my name is Mike Boozikers. I'm the superintendent out of the Boone homestead, and I've been in Ash Grove now for going on almost 7 years. When I moved to town, I got real interested in not only the Boone history, but trying to understand what Ash Grove looked like early on. I think a lot of people tend to think about Ash Grove history in 1871 or beginning in 1871. Our historic downtown is such an eye-catching piece of Ash Grove, but really there's a whole history of Ash Grove that exists prior to the town's founding. Ash Grove was part of the Louisiana Purchase, and that's really what kicks off settlement in Ash Grove. And a lot of people don't think about Ash Grove really being part of the frontier, but for a very short period of time, Ash Grove really set right on the edge of what was once America's frontier. What did Ash Grove look like in the 1830s as people were really starting to trickle in? We're 20 years or so past the Louisiana Purchase, and we have people arriving in the area. Early descriptions, and we've got a map we're going to share of the area, put Ash Grove right on the edge of the division between timber to the south and prairie to the north. And when you think about that, it was really a perfect area. Not only because of, you needed lumber to build homes for early industry, but there was an invention that had just been invented in the 1830s that really revolutionized and really opened lands out here on the frontier, and that was the John Deere plow. The prairie grasses scared a lot of early settlers. These massive native grasses have these massive root balls, and prior to the invention of the John Deere plow, they were thought to be unable to be plowed. And all of a sudden, these prairie lands can be used for fields, and you don't have to cut down trees, and you don't have to deal with the stumps, you don't have to burn anything out, and you can establish a farm pretty quickly. And that was one of the things that really attracted people to this area. One of the other things that makes Ash Grove unique is the water resources that are around Ash Grove. When you look at the area around Ash Grove, we've got tons of water, tons of springs. But the early, and what I like to call the original Ash Grove neighborhood, was actually north of town because of those water resources. So our early settlers, settled around Kelly Branch and Kelly Spring, and the Boones were on the springs there. We think of Ash Grove as being this very remote area, but there were actually two roads that came through Ash Grove in the 1830s. And if you look on this map that's circa 1835, to the west of Ash Grove, near where 160 crosses Sauk River, you'll see that there's a road that's described as the road to Delaware Town. Now, Delaware Town was a early establishment. It was a fur trading post, a Native American trading area that would have been south and east of Springfield. It's a canoe access today. And that road to the north went toward what is present-day Osage Village State Historic Site. Also in that area was an area that was known as Harmony Mission, and that's kind of on the south side of Kansas City. So there's this road leading, to the north and west out of Ash Grove, but there's also a road that goes directly through the Boone homestead that's described as the road to Springfield, and that was an early road of commerce into Springfield, and it ran into the northwest corner of what is today the present-day square there in Springfield. Ash Grove being situated where it's at, that early neighborhood, we're only, maybe less than a day's ride from Springfield. And Springfield in the early 1830s, it's a collection of log cabins. It hasn't really got its feet off the ground yet, but it's also at the intersection of the Wire Road. And the Wire Road is going to become a major thoroughfare for Southwest Missouri. Ash Grove is this massive melting pot of people. We've got settlers from Kentucky, like the Boones, settlers from Tennessee. We've got immigrant families coming into the area. And of course, coming along with these families are enslaved individuals brought into the Ash Grove neighborhood here in Boone Township. In 1840, we had 154 people living in the 6x6 square area that we know today as Ash Grove. However, by 1850, the population has increased to 974, which is described as free individuals. And then we had 242 enslaved individuals that were here just in Boone Township. And I think that kind of gives you a pretty good idea of what's going on. And a large chunk of that, of course, that ground that we know today as the Ash Grove neighborhood, was involved in agricultural pursuits of one way or another. By the 1850s, Ash Grove is really getting its feet on the ground. I think people in the area really saw the progress that was coming to Ash Grove. We know from Nathan Boone's probate that he'd actually invested in the railroad. This is prior to the Civil War. I think people were excited to see progress come to Southwest Missouri, and I think people saw people moving into the Ash Grove neighborhood. As the word of the railroad really starts to get off the ground, people start looking for ground around that railroad. So you can imagine when the railroad surveyors showed up in Ash Grove, they're looking for, once again, water resources, because trains are driven by steam at that time. That means about every 7 miles you've got to have a spot for a train to stop to fuel up with water. Now the railroad ran into one large issue here in Ash Grove, and that's the Boones and the Boone's extended family had the majority of the northern side of Ash Grove in that area that we know today that I like to call the Boone neighborhood landlocked. And within that Boone neighborhood, right, are all the springs and all the water resources. So as these railroad surveyors are coming through, they're looking for water. And one of the only springs in an undeveloped area of town sits just on the south side of Main Street. And so the railroad, it makes an obvious route choice is to go through what we know as today is downtown Ash Grove and where the railroad runs. The only challenge is that put the railroad on the south side of what was the original Boone neighborhood. So by 1870, as businesses are starting to move into Ash Grove and towns getting ready for the railroad, when Ash Grove was founded, the railroad isn't here yet, but people see the business opportunity and they start moving into the downtown area, and that is when town as we know it is really incorporated, and when we see a pretty big population shift from the area north by the Boone homestead moving south and wanting to be part of this new Ash Grove neighborhood. And by the 1860s, the outbreak of the Civil War has Ash Grove really on edge. We have stories from Margaret Kelso living just north of the Boone homestead on Clear Creek. She describes these raids via bushwhackers in the areas that specifically came into their house, broke down the front gate. Margaret's mother being greeted by them at the front door saying, "Hey, give us everything you got." She said, "I don't have anything." They're scooping coals out of the fireplace, throwing it across the floor there when they didn't get what they want. Margaret Kelso's mother, of course, sweeping it back into the fireplace, trying to prevent her house from being burned down. Margaret Kelso and her brother headed through the woods at night to warn the neighbors of these raids. So you can imagine Ash Grove is not a place you want to be. So Benjamin Howard Boone, there on the north side of the Boone homestead, he has an encounter with the Union Provost Marshal. He's got 9 enslaved individuals, so you can imagine he's probably not the most welcome person in the Boone neighborhood. He takes off shortly after that interaction with the Union Provost Marshal. The family that was renting the Boone house from Benjamin Howard, they claim to hear the cannons of Wilson's Creek all the way out here in Ash Grove. And they take off when they hear those cannons. The Boone home was abandoned at that time, and there's some great stories of the people that were squatting in the home through the Civil War. And it's actually, by 1860, we actually see a decrease in our population because there was a market crash in 1857, and we see small farm operations kind of go by the wayside. We see a large loss of the enslaved living in the area, heading out to other areas. In the 1830s, if you would have gone 1 mile to the east, you would have run into a mill. And that mill was run by 2 gentlemen, one of them by the name of Constantine Perkins. And kind of a fun fact for you, Constantine Perkins was not only a miller, he was one of Ash Grove's first doctors. So you can imagine going to the mill to drop off your flour, your corn, things to be ground. And hey, while you're there, you could get some medical care. Now, that medical care was probably pretty limited because if you look at a lot of the cemeteries, especially that are north of town, there's a lot of children buried in those cemeteries. And early medical care here in Ash Grove is pretty limited. When you called the doctor, it was generally probably too late to really do anything good. If you were to go a mile to the west from the Boone home on the Sauk River, there was another mill. It was run by a gentleman by the name of Josiah Birney. Now we know Birney started building the mill and actually petitioned the Greene County Court to be able to dam up the Sauk. He gets permission, but there seems to be a fumble in there someplace in his history where he might not have quite got the mill completed. He may have run out of money, but someone else picks up that mill, and it's listed on 1876 maps of Ash Grove. So we know that mill lasted at least through the Civil War, and maybe to the turn of the century, but there's actually not a whole lot of information on that mill. Now, one of my other favorite stories of the Ash Grove neighborhood takes place just about a half a mile east of the Boone homestead, and there was a distillery located there, and it was known as the Dutch Brothers Distillery, and it was run by 2 German immigrant brothers by the last name of Hospies. And the Louis Hospies was kind of the main proprietor of this organization. He followed the Boones west, essentially. In 1840, he had actually been living in the same town where Nathan and Olive were living, in Defiance, Missouri, before he decided to move to Greene County. He establishes this distillery operation in 1840. He actually gets thrown in jail twice, or called to court because he's operating it on a Sunday, which was against the law at that time. But it becomes one of the area's kind of first industries. He runs that distillery operation for 4 or 5 years before he decides he's going to chase the lumber industry. He ends up back in St. Louis, kind of getting involved with that before he's sent to Minnesota. And he's got an interesting history. People should Google his name sometime and do some reading. But he dies the president of a bank in Minnesota. So you can kind of imagine it's kind of this rags to riches story. He moves from Defiance, Missouri as a German immigrant, ends up here in Ash Grove, kind of running this distillery, gets into a little bit of trouble with the law in the process, gets involved in the logging industry before dying the president of a bank, right? And his home existed into the turn of the century, and there are pictures of his home online. It's this beautiful, we'll call it a mansion for the time period, but beautiful home. Now, if you were to go a mile or so to the south of the Boone homestead, you'd run into Ash Grove's first post office. And actually, Ash Grove gets its post office by 1840, the early 1840s. And there's a lot of myths that happen with Ash Grove's early post office. Nathan Boone, in one of our first actual mentions of Ash Grove, takes place in 1839. And Nathan is writing a letter to the Department of the War. And he says, hey, I'm residing in Ash Grove, and you can reach me via the Springfield post office. And that is in spring of 1839. So that first letter that Boone writes, that's really our first mention of Ash Grove as a town. And then just a few years later, Ash Grove gets its first post office. The first postmaster was a gentleman by the last name of Cook, and it existed in his home. He was only postmaster for about a year before then it transferred to another gentleman. But Ash Grove has had a post office by the name of Ash Grove since the early 1840s. There's kind of this local legend and oral history that Ash Grove for a time might have been known as Kimbrough. I think one of the things we can do with the post office records that still exist is we can kind of dispel that myth. Joseph Kimbrough was actually a merchant in the area, once again on the south side of the Boone homestead today, actually almost adjacent to the church where we're tonight is where he had his mercantile operation, and it became the post office, and he was the postmaster. And I can see where people think locally that, this story comes up that, oh, it was the name of Kimbrough. Well, it was the store where the post office was. And you'll actually see that he ran the Ash Grove post office just before the outbreak of the Civil War. The Civil War happens here in Ash Grove, and mail service is actually discontinued. And then after the Civil War, of course, that's when Ash Grove starts moving south because word of the railroad is going to come through the area. And that's when we see downtown established where it's at, and then the town's incorporation in 1871. Gentleman by the name of Lyman Draper, who actually came to the Boone homestead to interview Nathan and Olive. And he was corresponding with one of the Boone's neighbors. And the Boone's neighbor said, hey, you just need to come to Ash Grove and interview Nathan for this book that he's wanting to write. And he gives us a description of how to get to Ash Grove. And he says from St. Louis, you take a steamboat to Jefferson City. From Jefferson City, you take a stagecoach to Springfield, and that stagecoach runs 3 times a week. And from Springfield, you hire a horse and you take it to Ash Grove. And in September 1851, that's exactly how Lyman Draper got here to Ash Grove to interview Nathan and Olive Boone about, of course, Nathan's famous father, Daniel Boone. Another gentleman that gives us a great description of early Ash Grove is a gentleman by the name of John C. Cox. And John C. Cox is going to become an early settler in Joplin. But on his way to Joplin, he stopped here in Ash Grove in spring of 1839. And in his journal, he records that he's traveling south on the road to Springfield. He stops at a small shop for rain, and he actually stops at the Boone homestead. A lot of people don't realize that one of the first mercantile operations here in Greene County was operating out at the Boone homestead in 1837, right? One of the original stores in Ash Grove. And he says in his journal that at that store he procures some alcohol, shot, and salt, and then south to the home of Nathan Boone. And there he goes on to describe Nathan's daughters as the belles of Greene County. After leaving the Boone home, he proceeds into Springfield before heading west to Joplin. And he describes, too, in that journal entry, riding through the prairies and seeing the water resources that are here in the area. So it's one of the things that gives us one of our first written insights into what the early Ash Grove neighborhood looks like, and it's a pretty cool thing. think what we need to think about the early Ash Grove neighborhood is that it's this lasting legacy to the early settlers of the area. And when we look at downtown, you're seeing the successes of those early Ash Grove pioneers. Because of their hard work, we have Ash Grove as we know it today. And the beautiful downtown that you see down there, the brick structures that we see, and we're here because of those early settlers.